What can we learn about how organisations work beyond rational analysis? What, for example, can our bodies teach us? Simon Roberts, in his new book, The Power of Not Thinking, explains the numerous ways in which our body acquires, retains and employs information, and he shows us why we should learn to trust our instincts that inform the most crucial decisions and actions in our lives better. He believes that big data is far from having all the answers, and why there are limits to what's possible with artificial intelligence, and why humans are capable of far more than we currently are led to believe.
Hi folks, welcome to The Evolving Leader. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
I haven't talked to you in a bit, John. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling an embodied degree of excitement. How are you feeling, Scott?
I see what you did there. That'll become obvious why you said that in a moment. I'm feeling renewed. I just got done with a sort of impromptu 4 days of play and rejuvenation with the family. So nice. My heart is full and my belly is fuller. So I'm in danger of carb crashing at any moment. So if you see me sort of fading, although I don't think that has any chance of happening because I am really energized at the prospect here or at the opportunity to talk to our guest today, because today we are joined by Simon Roberts. Simon is one of the world's leading anthropologists researching the emerging frontiers of people and technology and applying that understanding with impact in complex organizations. Simon's 20-year career has included founding the UK's first dedicated ethnographic research company and running an innovation lab at Intel. He's a partner at the consultancy Stripe Partners that helps technologically led businesses invent better futures by combining social and data science to give companies a deeper understanding of the world, their customers, and their organizations. His new book, The Power of Not Thinking, was shortlisted for the Business Book Awards of 2021, and his work has been covered by Bloomberg, the FT, the BBC, and more. He has an MA and a PhD from Edinburgh University, and we're simply delighted to have this conversation today. Simon, welcome to The Evolving Leader.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Simon, welcome to the show. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. I'm feeling pretty exhausted after 18 months of sitting behind a screen, which I was just talking to my business partners today. You know, as he put it, one of my business partners put it, you know, we didn't sign up for this. You know, what we've signed up for, at least what I signed up for professionally, was a career getting out and about, meeting people, and trying to make sense of their worlds. And so, like everybody, I'm feeling a bit fatigued by apprehending the world through a rectangular shaped plane of glass. But I can see a glimmer of hope ahead. So 2022, I think, is the year to get back into the real world.
Yeah, I think we can all feel a lot of commonality with that. Can you start by giving us a bit of a rundown on your career and your background?
I suppose, quote unquote, I'm a classically trained anthropologist, which means that I went to do field work with not much of a clue as to what I was really going to discover and how I was going to discover it. Initially, that was looking at a popular Hindi film in North India, which led me to see quite quickly the impact of satellite television on cinema going and popular culture in general. So I stuck around and did a PhD exploring that satellite TV revolution in mid-90s India, and knew that I didn't want to stay on in academia. So had a sense that anthropology should be pretty useful to the world of business, but I don't think anyone, at least in my field of vision at the time, no one had really applied it. It struck me meaningfully in business. So I sort of made an attempt to get going on that, set up a tiny little company, you know, home built a website using Microsoft homepage for the older listeners amongst you. And, you know, did some ads on Google and started to sell ethnographic research. Ethnography is what anthropologists do. Did that for 3 or 4 years in London, got some nice clients, had lots of fun. And then Intel tapped on the door and said, would you like to join us? We're hiring about 35 anthropologists. So I thought that sounds good. Let's see what life looks like on the other side of the corporate wall, as it were. And I worked with Intel for 5 years running kind of global research, primarily around health and aging. out of Ireland, working with designers and really smart technologists and loads of clinicians and healthcare experts in hospitals around Ireland. So, hugely different adventure from, trying to sell little projects to companies in London. And more recently, I set up Stripe Partners with a couple of brave souls, and we've been plugging away at that now for 8 years. Work with a lot of technology companies. Primarily, we're offering kind of ethnographic research, anthropological perspectives on business problems, and partly the experience at the business led me to sort of write a book and try to articulate a little bit about what we believe and why we think that matters. So in a nutshell, that's me.
Excellent. I think most of us have some sort of understanding of what an anthropologist does and what ethnographic research is, but it's probably quite fuzzy when you get into the basics. So can you just, like, for the benefit of my grandmother, explain what you do and how you do it?
Yeah. Anthropology, I suppose, is ultimately most easily articulated or explained in terms of what anthropologists do, which is, at least historically, was very different to how other people went about understanding the world, which is anthropologists go places. So if we want to understand, the life and times of, a North American golf club and the community of its members, you join the club or you become a caddy. You engage in long-term kind of field work, often very open-ended, not hypothesis-led, but open-ended, exploratory. And so it's characterized essentially through that technique, ethnography. But anthropologists, I suppose, are different from other social scientists in that we're not kind of hypothesis-led on the whole. We try to be open-minded. We try to see the world, as T.S. Eliot said, as if for the first time through children's eyes. So we try to act as kind of naive observers, pretend we know nothing, and try to build an understanding of how people themselves create meaning, create the webs of significance in which we all operate, and which are largely hidden from view. So I think that's the thing that animates me about it, is that most of what matters to people, most of what signifies culture, is actually very rarely expressed by people. It's taken for granted. So a lot of our job is really trying to look beyond what people tell us, to really investigate the sort of social silences, if you will, see what it is they're not telling us, because usually what people are not telling us is the things they assume are obvious. But when you're studying other people, it's the things that they think are obvious, which are actually very revelatory. And
just digging into the detail a bit, so you're trying to do, I'm paraphrasing here, but you're trying to make the implicit explicit, which is quite a craft to do it, because people can't even necessarily articulate what it is happening. So can you give us some of the kind of practical techniques you might use to uncover what's actually going on?
God, that's a fiendishly difficult question. And I think in part it strikes at the heart of why I said earlier, I was classically trained, and trained is the inoperative word there, because I think traditionally British anthropologists, not American anthropologists actually, who have much longer training than British ones, are just sort of told, go there, it'll be fine. Send me a letter occasionally. My supervisor said, I sent him a few faxes, didn't have email at the time. So a lot of it is actually just this simple thing of just jumping in. And I think that when you jump into a foreign culture, what immediately strikes you is what feels uncomfortable and what feels different, right? So, that might show up as, the proximity that other people want to have relative to you, in space. It may show up in the mistakes you make. So the example I often use is a North Indian tea shop. When you finish your cup of tea, you do not put the empty teacup back on the table, because it's dirty, it's polluted. You put it on the floor. So often a lot of what you're learning is either through what makes you feel uncomfortable, or where you've broken a rule which of course is not, there's no sign in an Indian tea shop that says, do not put your empty cups back on the table. So you've broken an implicit rule that operates in that culture. And it's only through the breaking or the breaching of a social norm that you make it visible. So I'd like to sort of characterize anthropology as full of wonderful, amazing, explicit techniques. And of course there are some, but I actually think it's, to demystify it a little, it's also worth saying, that it's accessible to everybody, because we learn when we make those kinds of mistakes, and it's those mistakes that are hugely revealing.
It feels more like a craft than a science in some respects.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you're going to be good at anything, I mean, not to kind of invoke the famous 10,000 hours, although, there's debate about that, but I do write in my book about practice and the importance of practice for, honing skill and for skill to become kind of embodied. So, you don't have to think about what you're doing. And I think, I think, as you say, that's exactly it. It's really about learning to listen, learning to see, learning to try to simultaneously be in a social situation and then slightly outside of it. So it's like that kind of vision of that somebody might have on a deathbed of them floating above their body in the bed, right? You're trying to sort of be in but out at the same time. And I think it's, professions love to kind of draw boundaries around themselves and put walls up and say you can't enter into here without oodles of training and so forth. Of course, some of that's often true, if you want to be an accountant or a lawyer, but I like to think I'm big tentish about this. Like, you can do it, you just need to create the time and the space and read some stuff and talk to good people about it. And I think it's accessible to everyone. And I'd like to think that's one of the messages of my book, actually, that it's kind of relatively cheap and easy to do. You just need to carve out the time and space to do it.
So let's turn to your book, if we can. So in your book, you break down the idea of embodied knowledge.
Yeah.
So before we go any further, can you give us an initial idea or overview about, what that is and why we should learn to trust our bodies more?
Yeah. So, I mean, I start with an enemy, like I suppose most books or bits of writing often need an enemy to push against. And the enemy that I push against, I suppose, is not necessarily the brain, but it's certainly a view of the world in which, the brain has predominated or even dominated the way we think about intelligence. And so what I'm really trying to do is not necessarily to turn it all on its head, because I'm not anti, obviously, brains and intellectualism and cognition, but rather to say that our bodies play a really significant role in how we apprehend, comprehend, experience the world, and we'd be as well to listen to our bodies and to use them. So embodied knowledge, as the name suggests, is knowledge that is laid down in our bodies. It's knowledge that we acquire through using our bodies to experience the world, to be in it, and is often acquired through the repetition of practices. So I use the example of driving, for example. And it's knowledge that has sort of very different characteristics from more theoretical or explicit knowledge. And it's those characteristics that I think have been underemphasized, undervalued, particularly in the world of business. And it was time to try to bring them back into the mix.
So you use the driving example. So the idea being that you have this sort of stored knowledge in your body and you can sort of do it without conscious thinking. So, but isn't that still that sort of the habitual sort of pattern forming of the brain, or is it really information stored in the body? How do we delineate between what's the brain's ability to create habit versus the body knowledge?
Well, I think it's most accurately kind of portrayed as a continuum. I mean, we probably all had the experience when we're driving, can be a slightly terrifying one of realizing you haven't really been paying attention for like 15, 20, 30 seconds. It's like, how the hell's my car still on the right side of the road? Right. One hopes that doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And we're often doing a lot of other things while we drive, talking to passengers and that sort of thing. So I'm not specialist enough to know kind of, as it were, where the brain ends and the body begins. That's, I think is a more specialist field that, I don't try to wade into. What I think is the case, what I argue is the case, is that socially, educationally, we have tended to favor, the knowledge that we have above the shoulders, and we've downplayed, the ways in which our body, as I said, acquires this knowledge, but is also able to use it in very changeable, fluxy kind of environments. And often that is, we are doing things without thinking about them. Ask a craftsman or woman, or, a potter or a sculptor, kind of what they're doing, and it becomes very difficult for them to articulate. I often think that's why sort of footballers talking about football is so incredibly boring. I mean, because you're trying to make explicit something that's so sort of magical and sort of all embodied. As soon as you try and turn it into words, it just falls utterly flat, which is probably one of the pitfalls of trying to write a book about embodied knowledge, right? It's like, it's such a kind of weird, ephemeral thing that you can barely grasp. Try and put some words on it, and I fear sometimes it falls flat.
I like the example you gave, because I experienced it yesterday, in fact, where you talk about, you don't know your PIN number until, your fingers do the pattern. So if someone said, what's the PIN number for this door? You wouldn't necessarily be able to say the PIN number. In fact, it would make you forget it.
Yeah.
But as soon as you start doing that, you know the pattern, and it's because your body knows the pattern.
Your body knows the pattern, and it's, it's a slightly silly example, but probably at school we were all taught, what are the 10 biggest capital cities in the world, or what are the 5 longest rivers or something, and that's knowledge of a very, not quite theoretical, but it's certainly a certain form of knowledge, right? And it's very easy to forget, but ask somebody to change a light bulb, or a bayonet light bulb, or ride a bicycle, even if you've done it for, I don't know, when was the last time you rode a bike? You don't forget it. I'm very kind of intrigued by that sort of that retentive nature of this kind of knowledge. I mean, it's certainly the case that skills can become blunted from not performing them often, but it's very rare that we have a kind of a physical skill that we completely forget how to do, unless we maybe suffer some form of traumatic brain injury, which maybe comes back to your question, Scott, which is, of course, there are bits of the brain, that are implicated in this. It's not like we're the octopuses that I write about in the book, that you can sort of, chop off a leg and it will still be an arm, rather, and it will still be able to operate because it has cognitive, it has neurons in it. We're not like that. If you take our head off, lo and behold, we can't do anything and we're dead. It's not the same with other creatures. But anyway.
No, I finished the Power of Not Thinking at the weekend, which I really enjoyed. And in it, you start by giving us a summary of how the mind came to dominate our view of intelligence and knowledge, and also how that kind of disembodied knowledge encourages us to view the world in a more detached way. Could you talk us a little bit through the kind of context for the book?
Yeah. So it's I suppose it's, again, going back to sort of baddies, and I'm sure René Descartes was not so much of a baddie, but I think he's a good figure to sort of push against, because he represents a useful starting point in, the development of Western thought. I think it's probably important to stress Western thought, which started to divide the brain and the body, started to divide the mind and the body in the way that we talk about, the role that they have in our understanding of the world, in our experience of the world. And he set in train, I suppose, something which has echoed through the ages, the idea that the knowledge we acquire through our cognitive abilities is in some way surer, more, not necessarily more perfect, more objective, more distant from the sort of knowledge that we acquire through the body, which is perhaps more, emotional, more related to kind of our nervous system, more engaged, and therefore more prone to mislead us. So he sets this sort of distinction running. And actually Descartes was a mathematician. And so he was a long line of thinkers who started to explore the way in which kind of mathematical symbols could be used to literally map the world and to map phenomena in the world. So Cartesian coordinates kind of are one of Descartes' inventions, and from Cartesian coordinates come GPS, comes maps, becomes these tools that create representations of the world that are not the world, right? Which is something that sort of interests me. And so if you take that idea that you can kind of represent the world with an array of symbols, numbers, letters, whatever you wish, and then you can start to manipulate them, you kind of quickly get to the first sort of calculating machines, and then of course in time to mechanical brains, which is what the first computers were called, and then electronic brains. And so what you have then is the kind of illusion, if you will, that through the manipulation of these symbols that represent different elements of the world, you can kind of create accounts of the world that have not necessarily omnipotent sort of validity, but are in some way more distant, more objective than other kind of ways of knowing the world. And then it's a short jump from those kind of electronic brains, of the earlier 20th century to big data, right? And of course we now live in a world in which big data is meant, maybe time has been called on that a little bit, but is meant to sort of present very clear, calm, rational, cool views of the world. So I think I quote, is it D.H. Lawrence, the map is not the territory. And I just love that, because I think we've created a kind of an intellectual scaffolding within business and far beyond, which sort of suggests if we figure out how to build a map, we've been somehow created a point of view on the territory. And I think that's desperately misleading. And so the rest of the book is really about saying, well, how do we understand that territory? Let's move away from the map and get in amongst it.
One thing that sparked a thought in me when I was reading about you were talking about the implications of embodied understanding and the development of big data and AI, and I was looking at Antonio Damasio's research on somatic markers, and the work that he does there is basically looking at people's appetite for risk, and actually their bodies know before their brains do that this is a bad risk as opposed to a better one. And that being able to trust your body means that you are able to, ironically, from Descartes' kind of perspective, your body is more rational in that respect and less subject to all the biases, all the cognitive biases, because the brain is actually quite restrictive in terms of the amount of information it can process and in the way it does it, because it's basically working on these, heuristics and, kind of little rules of thumb, whereas the body is actually a bit more unfiltered in terms of its information. So it's funny that neuroscience is almost overturning the notion of the body being the more emotional and prone to irrational thinking, and it's more rational in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think that was one of the things that sort of intrigued me, because when I started sort of researching the book, you start sort of turning over stones in different disciplines, and there's cognitive science, there's philosophy, there's anthropology, and neuroscience is such an amazingly kind of like wide and complex field. So I don't claim much expertise. I don't claim much expertise in anything really, but I certainly don't claim expertise in neuroscience. But what really kind of struck me was how all of these disciplines are actually circling their wagons around this idea, right? And I think, although perhaps there are plenty of missed opportunities in any book. I talk to people who work in, fields as diverse as kind of theatre and the arts and in virtual reality, and they're all sort of saying, this idea of embodiment is really kind of happening at the moment in these fields. So it is odd, I think, that many disciplines which, in their very naming, cognitive science and neuroscience, are ostensibly ones of kind of what's above your shoulders, are quickly realizing that, at least to rebalance one's account of how humans work, you have to look a bit beyond the brain too. So I suppose, in its own very small way, my book is an attempt to try to do some of that rebalancing work.
So you list out 5 features of embodied knowledge. Could you give us a high-level overview of what those are?
Yeah, I can. So I think the first one, they're both sort of features, and they're also ways in which that knowledge gets acquired. I mean, I start with observation, and I called the chapter Observation, even though actually what I'm saying is that a lot of Western thought and Western thinking about how we know the world is really about the eyes, when actually observation is a bodily thing. We're sensor-laden animals, and we observe the body through the use of all of the sensory capabilities that we have. So that's observation. The second one is the idea of practice, which is that the act of doing things allows us to lay down in very physical and kind of neurophysical ways knowledge about that activity. So I use the example of craftsmen who can learn how to do really quite intricate things without any explicit instruction in them, merely by both observing them and then repeating them for themselves. I also talk about retention, and for me this is one of the most interesting areas, which, as I said earlier, is this idea about the knowledge that gets kind of accreted into, quite literally into the physical kind of substrate of our bodies, and emerges from our kind of experience of the physical environment, and the nature of that environment. So I talk about how you might go around a supermarket and you sort of know where you are, right? You know where you are, both perhaps because, when you're out of the sort of freezer aisles, that you're in the canned or tinned, food area, or, from smells, you might know you're near the end of your journey and you're up near the bread counter. So there's a sensory aspect to the ways in which we kind of learn, where we are in the world, and our memory of those places. Another feature of embodied knowledge is its kind of its improvisory nature. So it allows us to improvise in circumstances which are either unanticipated or more likely unknowable. So driving is a kind of is a good example of improvisation, because it's very rarely the case that 2 car journeys are ever the same. Everything is always changing. I think I quote some research by Oxford University that not only says that, of course, no journey is the same, but actually roads change so significantly that we're always presented with kind of unknown, unforeseeable events. So our body is centrally implicated in how we recognize patterns in situations, and how we're able, as I think we talked about earlier, to make very snap and often very important judgments based on a kind of multisensory pattern recognition in different situations. So I talk about famous work done with firefighters and how they make sense of the buildings that they're in, and how they run through, without really thinking about it, run through a series of sort of patterns and things they've seen before to make judgments about, for example, when to vacate a building. So improvisation is this critical thing. The last idea or feature that I talk about is empathy. And empathy is something that we often talk about, I think, both colloquially, but also in academic circles as a very cognitive or very psychological phenomenon. It's about sort of seeing the world from other people's perspectives. It's also about feeling the world from other people's perspectives. And what I talk about in relation to empathy is the vital contribution that the body plays to how we make sense of what other people are thinking and feeling, and how through by trying to experience what other people experience, we can get much closer to understanding what it is that they're thinking and feeling. And there's a sort of slight kink in the argument, I think, because again, coming back to the work of neuroscientists, there has been lots of work, particularly around the idea of mirror neurons, which suggests strong relationships between elements of our brain that are related to movement and elements of our brain, the neurons in our brain that relate to how we make sense of experiences. So in short, the argument is that by performing an action or seeing somebody rather perform an action, your body is in a sense mimicking that action. So when somebody smells, dog shit or something, and goes ugh, and grimaces, you actually have a sense of what they are experiencing, because you can read their physical gesture, and your body and your brain together turn that into an unpleasant experience, which you can empathize with.
So all these features are incredibly interesting to me, and I'd love to hone in even more on what you're saying about empathy. I just read last week an article about empathy perhaps being arguably maybe the most important skill a leader could possess, in relation to all the different skills.
Yeah.
So for somebody listening right now who is tracking with this and maybe, knows they need to engage in deeper empathy and leading their teams and their organizations, what's the opportunity? How does somebody get more connected to the sort of embodied sense of an empathetic experience in their daily lives?
I think in a nutshell, get out there and go do it for yourself. So, the founding story of our business is actually when some executives from Duracell in North America said, we're really honest, and we've got a rational, strategic, data-driven perspective on 3 market segments we want to go after, but we don't really understand what's going on, and can you help? And we said, well, sure. And they said, we want to do things differently, and we said, brilliant. They said, well, we want to understand sort of the great outdoors and outdoors people as a category, as a target market. We said, well, let's go camping then. So we shipped a whole load of camping equipment into a national park in Southern California. And we took a bunch of Duracell execs, ad agency people, media planners, and they all turned up with their little wheelie cases from Manhattan. And we bundled them into a minibus, and we took them up to a national park. And we all froze our nuts off. I mean, it was cold and it was very dark, and we had people up there who were campers and loved camping, and we learned the craft, and we really understood their perspective. And fundamentally, it was about, getting outside of your cubicle, outside of your meeting room, outside of, your Marriott Courtyard hotel, outside of an airport, and actually just getting into that space. And in a way, the entire book is really a kind of an attempt for me in long form to try to understand why that had impact, and that client, still says, that was my favorite piece of research ever. He said also it was the best ever piece of research. He said, because my team just got it. And so, the ultimate thing for me, if there's any message about this book in the world of business that I want people to take away, is that, yes, you sometimes need spreadsheets, you need segmentations, you need the map. You can't always have the territory. But God, how important it is to get yourself out into the territory and to see and hear and smell and experience it for yourself. Because, let's say you run a chain of restaurants or something in Britain. Yeah, you can have NPS scores coming back every day, and you can have data on, how clean the toilets are or whatever. You can have any sort of metric you want, right? And any array of sensors and inputs to present that data to you. But fundamentally, what you want to know is, what is it like to be a customer in my restaurant? What is the experience like? Is it warm? Is it cold? Is the tempo of the service right? Is the smells of the food, right? Is the music too loud, too quiet? How can we reorganize the space to make the ultimate customer experience? None of those things can be done from behind a desk or hiding behind a spreadsheet. So that is it for me. And of course, that's been a difficult thing to do over the last 18 months. But I really think it was important before. It's even more important now. We have to get out and understand the world if we truly want to get it.
So we have a whole kind of set of industries that are doing the absolute opposite of what you're talking about, which is relying more and more on proxies because data is so attractive and this idea. So you talk a little bit about the dangers of building businesses and industries purely in that way. Let's talk about what we're missing. What are we actually not seeing when we do that?
I think, it's so hard, isn't it? I mean, it's something so fundamental. What are you really missing? I think what it is that great businesses are run with this really strong intuitive understanding of what matters to people, and a really strong commitment to making sure that whatever it is that matters is delivered, and is delivered consistently. And I think as soon as you set up a set of proxies that claim to capture that and to measure it, you're basically taking a kind of a step back. You're you're doing a lot of violence, as it were, to the fundamental construct on which you claim your business is based, right? Which is customer experience or whatever, the customer experience, whatever it is. So I can totally understand the attraction in a world in which we want to make everything just in time, just optimized. And yet, I think that one of the great ironies of the last 18 months has been to see that, everything being optimized to within an inch of its life, everything being kind of just in time to the last second, sounds very rational, sounds very business-like. Actually, there's such poverty in that idea, because what you basically do is just strip out anything that gives you edge, right? An ability to deal with things that are yet unknown. So I quite recognize that it may seem like a vast luxury to send a bunch of executives camping, and it's never always been hugely easy, at least in the beginning, to justify that to people. But it's not a luxury. It's not a luxury, because it gets you much closer to the source, and a source which can be very sustaining, I think, for teams. In other words, those experiences live on. Back to the point about retention, you just don't forget that stuff. You forget a PowerPoint slide I give you about that experience, but you won't forget being really cold, sleeping next to a creative director who snored like an utter pig, kept everybody awake for hours. You won't forget that one of the campers, had a gun and weed, but was absolutely brilliant and incredibly informative. So you won't forget any of those things, and those sustain you in ways that this other type of knowledge do not. And they also do something which sounds incredibly kind of, how do I put it, emotive. But actually what I found over the years is doing this actually reconnects people with why it is that they do their job at all. Right. And I think that's become really important as well. Like, we're now sitting behind rectangular screens the entire time. And like, what actually are we a part of? What are we actually building? And so any of those, things, esprit de corps, company culture, like being part of a family. I know that's not a very a particularly right on way of talking about what a company culture should be like. People talk negatively about talking about it as a family, but being part of a company is about more than just what you do. It's the feeling you get from being around people, and so all of these things are, for me, they're features of the embodied nature of experience. And now is the worst time ever, I think, to sort of hide behind our dashboards.
Which organizations have you seen that are best at maintaining that continuous connection with the world in the way that you're describing?
Well, it's not very fashionable to say it because everybody beats up on Facebook, but actually, Facebook, we do a lot of work with, and Spotify, companies like that, they have absolutely, at least before, the global pandemic kicked in, totally got what we were doing. We'd take 10 of them, we'd go somewhere in the world, we'd all go out, we'd have experiences that were designed to bring us closer to the phenomenon we were trying to understand. We'd really get in there, get away from our inboxes and explore that, make sense of it together, align on kind of what we thought was coming through, why it might matter, what it might mean for what we have to do or what they have to do. And again, it sounds extravagant, but it fills the tank, quite simply. It just so, it's not an extravagance at all, actually. It's much more extravagant, in my view, to kind of build some artificial kind of device, the old calculating machine, Babbage's computer to try to build your understanding of the world. I mean, that just seems like a sort of fanciful exercise in, just doing it because it's a challenge, right? But just freeing up your people to get out there and go and explore and make sense of it, have experiences, and, God, have some fun. I mean, I know it's a bit old fashioned, but I think work should be fun. It should engage and inspire. So it works in companies that I think take that seriously and interestingly. Of course, they're companies that also have, amazing array of data. So, and you sort of need both. I'm not beating up on data. I'm saying you need one with the other, and then you've got something pretty magical. So those are the sorts of companies, but it's not just them. I mean, our first clients were Procter and Gamble. So they're a traditional legacy business, but they felt they needed something new. So I think it is for everyone. It's accessible. There's a debate about the cost and about the extravagance or the apparent extravagance of it. But I'm prepared to have that debate.
Hi everyone, I'm Phil Kirby, producer of The Evolving Leader. We're so grateful to you, our growing band of listeners from around the world. And so we can continue to evolve, we would really love it if you could give us just 3 or 4 minutes of your time to complete our listener survey using the link in the show notes. And while you're feeling generous, please also go to Apple Podcast and leave us a rating and a review. Thanks for listening.
Everything you've been talking about doesn't just sound true to me. It actually feels true in my body. Mm-hmm. Like I feel my senses sort of awakening at the notion of, experience over being sort of stuck behind the rectangle screen as we all have been. You also talk about the importance of embodied knowledge for policymakers. Can you share your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, so early on in the research, I came upon this I came upon this thing called the refugee simulator. And again, like, maybe I just sort of, I like being friends with things that get beat up on. But it used to get beat up on every year on Twitter because they showed up at Davos, which is the ultimate kind of like, here are rich people, like private jets, flown in to drink champagne, limoed up to a hill, with no view about what the world really looks like. And so there was this amazing guy called David Begbie who'd set up a charity many years before doing something quite different, actually, recycling unwanted furniture and clothes from Hong Kong. And that's where he's based. Anyway, he'd set this simulator up as an antidote to sort of doing a 10-year birthday party for the charity. And it was just an attempt to sort of try to show, policymakers what it was like to have men turn up in your village in the middle of the night with large guns and separate you up as a family, and for you to then spend, I can't remember exactly the number of years that the average refugee spends as a refugee, but it's in, I think it's 20 or 30 years. It's of that kind of order, so what is it like? So he put this thing together in Hong Kong, which is 24 hours long, and I went through it. But he does a version of it, which is an hour in the Hilton in Davos. And as I said, everyone always kind of beats up on it. But I think there's an important point there, which is, as we move through large organizations, perhaps become more senior, our world sort of turns inward. A lot of it's about management, a lot of it's about money, a lot of it's about people and HR and strategy. And it seems to me the more divorce we get from what it is we're really in an organization to try to do, or what our organization is there for. So in the same disease, if you will, that afflicts businesses, I think, it tends to afflict policymakers and to a large extent politicians too. So I think they are an equal audience for this kind of approach. And I'm probably not the only one. I mean, there's lots of shows in Britain, sort of getting sort of rich businessmen or politicians to go and live on £50 a week or whatever, right? So how are you really going to understand? It's very topical at the moment. Universal credit's been cut by £20, so it's leaving people, £80 a week to live on, right? How do you know what that feels like? Well, there's a couple of different ways you can find out, but one of them is to try it for yourself, right? And to make those decisions about heating versus eating versus, broadband data or mobile data for your phone so you can apply for jobs. So my argument, just as it is for businesses, is that the politicians and policymakers need to do some of this for themselves as well, because without that, they're sort of, they're flying in the dark.
How do you enhance your own ability to trust and apply embodied knowledge? So, I mean, I'm just picturing, that situation of trying to experience poverty or experience, the dilemma of, heat or eat, and using every ounce of kind of intellectual stuff to rationalize away all of that, creating argument. I mean, I don't know if I would or wouldn't, but I can imagine some people might. How do you build more connection with what you're experiencing?
I think it comes back to a bit of where I started, which is actually, I think what it requires of people is as an ability to actually to want to feel some degree of discomfort, or at least the willingness to be able to entertain the idea that what you're going to do might actually not be very nice, might be pretty uncomfortable, both physically, but also obviously, emotionally too. And the argument I make in the book is that actually, I suppose traditionally one feels that if you're really hungry and you're really tired and you're really stressed because, as happened in the simulator, somebody's been pointing a gun at you. I mean, I hate guns, whether they're loaded or not. I mean, this was a real one. It wasn't loaded. It frightens the bloody life out of me. I hate, I don't like being around guns. So, but what that did was it primed me for what happened next, which was for me to acquire a load of more factual knowledge about refugees, right? So we have this kind of tendency to think, to be a good to be ready to learn something, you need to be kind of quite settled and quiet and sitting still and ready to absorb. And I think actually quite the opposite, that there's an argument that, actually sort of unsettling people in quite specific topical ways is a really good way to sort of prepare them to take on information that otherwise might just frankly just bounce off. I mean, and I think, so yeah, there's a priming piece there which has value, but runs slightly counter to the way we typically think about when we're ready to learn something. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, well, I think this is what it does, is it provokes a thought process, which is the distance between what you're talking about and how I might normally assess a situation analytically, and how that feels differently. So I think that's a really useful way of starting to help us think about it. Yeah, I mean, I've just read this terrifying book called The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, and it's just this sort of cascade of just like horrific, horrifying stories about what is happening to the climate, and it's so easy for that kind of just litany of just like horrible facts and figures to just bounce off you. So how can one, I think that's a real present challenge, right? How do you actually make that visceral? Like, a lot of people are going to show up in Glasgow, right? And it's going to be, yes, there's going to be some canapes, and there's going to be some champagne, there's going to be warm words and scary PowerPoint presentations. But at what point, or in what ways can we really get people to confront what is happening, right? And that's a very extreme example, and it's an urgent one. But I'm really interested in how you move people, quite literally move people through experience rather than just data. Because I think that's the thing that drives change and forces action. And that could be in a business, or it could be at a global climactic level. You talked about discomfort. What was the experience that created the most discomfort in you? I'll be really honest with you. I remember in the early days of my doctoral fieldwork in India, and I mean, this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but a guy had just committed suicide on the Ganges, and he'd self-immolated himself. I didn't really know much more about it than that, and I just said something really kind of, I didn't mean it to sound blasé at all, but I sort of said to an Indian friend, well, not quite kind of, I guess it's okay because it's by the Ganges, and that's, you get liberation if you die in that part of India, in that city by that river. But I said something along those lines, which was a very sort of theoretical, kind of slightly Western Orientalist kind of, oh, but it's okay because, the scriptures say if you do that here, it's And he kind of looked at me kind of aghast, quite rightly, and sort of said, yeah, but, he's dead, and he was a dad and he had kids. And so I'm probably bearing more of myself than I ought to in saying that, because I sound like such a, it sounds so crass, but I think that's a really good example for me of just like one form of knowledge sort of just rubbing up against a very different form of knowledge, right? And for obvious reasons, I've never forgotten it. It was just one of those things. I remember writing about it that day. It was just a kind of good example of like, what you read in a book, back to the map versus the territory might not be quite the same as the reality. That left me feeling a bit silly and pretty uncomfortable. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, Simon, thank you. This has been insightful. And like I said a moment ago, it just feels really true. Everything you're saying is resonating with me on a very sort of sensory level. So thank you for taking the time with us today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Simon. I think you've landed a number of ideas here and observations which will resonate deeply with our listeners, because I think we're all struggling to get more connected with what's going on. And you've given us here some very practical ways about thinking about it differently.
All right, folks, be sure to order your copy of The Power of Not Thinking today. And until next time, remember, the world is evolving. Are you?